Welcome, everybody. It is January 27th, 2025. You're listening to the Jack Stockwell program here at Global Affairs Unfiltered. And I got a text there that I hadn't started the stream. I will start it at the same time the K-Talk radio broadcast starts. So I am simulcasting between K-Talk radio right now as well as the stream. So good morning. And there are plenty of things for me to pick back up on. There was an interview that happened the other day between Helga Zepp-LaRouche of the Schiller Institute and Colonel Larry Wilkerson. Now, if you've been listening to any of the Napolitano podcasts, he has a whole litany of guests that are all worth listening to as far as world affairs are concerned. Just listening to Douglas McGregor, and you want him for Secretary of Defense. Listening to Larry Johnson, I would want him for the head of the CIA, and so on. Listening to Blumenthal, and I would want him as the press secretary. But we don't get those things. But you still get a great understanding of what's going on around this planet when you are able to watch and pay attention and listen to people who really know what's going on. Now, this next week, another month yet, will be my 30th anniversary on K-Talk. 30 years, more than a third of my life. And I have enjoyed this because not only have I enjoyed your friendship and your listenership, and there were times during the regular weekly show when K-Talk was having some great listenership numbers. I mean, in the multiples of tens of thousands of listeners every day to K-Talk back in our heyday. And there's no reason why with some concerned effort we could get back to that. But I'm just saying this because as I was finishing the last show talking about how we went from a productive economy to a speculative economy, it's been a disaster in almost every metric you can come up with. And I don't know what Donald Trump might be proposing in the main, if really a solution for this. I hope that it is, but I think what's happening in the world is going to force it more so than Donald Trump can do. Now, as I mentioned, there was this interview that went on between Mrs. LaRouche and Larry Wilkerson the other day, and I have some notes from it that I want to get into because in just the last 48 to 72 hours, no, I guess it's more than that, 2 to 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, there's something very disturbing coming from the new president. And one of them, of which I am paying particularly close attention to, is that warning orders have gone to the 10th Mountain Division in New York, to the 4th Division Mechanized in Colorado, and it went out to the 82nd Airborne Division at Camp Liberty, which of course formerly Fort Bragg in North Carolina. And these warning orders, if they are executed, and I have no doubt that they're already underway because of Pete Hegseth as the newly confirmed Secretary of Defense, will put anywhere from, I guess what they're saying now is 20 to 25,000 U.S. soldiers on the southern border. I think that might be creating some problems we don't already have, because it's a major takeaway from the land forces in this country and a dedication of them to a mission that is still needs to be proven, as has been expressed by several military experts, whether it's worth its salt or not. And in addition to that, the president has started doing things that are worrisome. As I said earlier, he's decided to go ahead and give the 2,000-pound bombs to Israel. And he has already, you know, he with his firings, his laying offs, and his appointments, he started eliminating women from position in the U.S. Armed Forces. Now that's disturbing. When I listened to what Colonel Wilkerson had to say, that over the last decade of what this empire really needs, if it wants to maintain a halfway ready army, and that's, you know, he says is conscription, a draft. Because we simply can't recruit. We cannot recruit quality people in our armed forces anymore. He's very, very clear on this. He said, we have failed to recruit the numbers necessary for all the services, with the Marine Corps an exception, but barely so, for the last 4 to 5 years. Said the only reason the Army, for example, the service where he had spent most of his time, last year barely met the Army's goal was with women recruits. He said women actually jumped into the breach, as it were, and answered the call, and were recruited in far greater numbers than they anticipated. He said they filled in for the men who didn't participate. He said this is backed by the polls that show that the propensity to serve for the average American in the 18 to 24-year-old group, the vulnerable group, if you will. He said they say that that group would be drafted were a conscription policy is only 9%. And he said 9% of America's youth eligible to serve in the military forces are willing to serve. 9% of American youth. I don't know where these polls are taken, at high school, senior year in high school, summer after graduation. It wasn't really clear the timing of the poll, but 9% of American youth, I guess of conscription age, which would be 18 or more, wanted to serve would be willing to serve the country. So dedicating all these troops to the border is one thing for Trump to make a political point, because that was one of his political promises in his campaign. It's another thing, the negative thing is you're diverting forces that might be needed somewhere else, especially as to what some people are predicting might happen around the Schenectady area of New York this week. I don't know if I have time to get into that or not. Maybe I have to wait till tomorrow. But the positive thing that could really be negative too, it's very difficult to see what's really going on except to satisfy a political promise. And while 20 to 25,000, let's just say 25,000 on that border sounds like a lot of troops, it isn't. You go from Brownsville, what's the name? The fort, what's its name? Way down there, at the very bottom tip of Texas. Way down below Corpus Christi. Brownsville's down there, but there's another place. It doesn't matter. From there to San Diego, 25,000 troops is nothing. And when you've got that much distance to man and the propensity for things to happen, when you have armed troops on the U.S. border, they present a situation that can get out of hand really quickly. And that's not all. I want to run through a few more things here, looking at my notes from that interview. We have eliminated, or we're in the process of eliminating, many of what American military and government in general knows as these inspector generals. Was there something like 25, 20 something of them? These are people who are mostly autonomous in terms of command structure in which they serve. But they're watchdogs. And when you eliminate the watchdogs, you eliminate the ability to be autonomous, to be able to if from a less than totally intimidating point of view, go to the boss and say, boss, you're naked. You're marching out in front of these people with no clothes on. And you're really courting some problems. And there's a lot of other things that are happening that don't look good domestically for the empire, but you have to wait and see what the impact is. And if the president is really serious about carrying some of these things out. But it's not looking good domestically, especially from the perspective that the national security perspective. And I don't know if they're going to bring this up in the hearings this week with Patel and Gabbard, as far as internal security is concerned. But if you understand the position of Director of National Intelligence, you look at, you know, if you had a funnel, and at the top of the funnel you've got all the various governmental, the armed forces, and all of the intelligence gathering inside of each of the armed forces, and national security, and Defense Institute, the DNI, and all the other kinds of intelligence gathering, surveillance, everything else that makes up. And all of that comes to a funnel, and Tulsi Gabbard is sitting there. You see, the problem is that President Trump is getting a lot of bad advice. A lot of bad advice about Israel, about Gaza, about the Ukraine. For some of the comments he made the other day about Russia, Russia's economy falling apart, Russia's army being decimated. Absolute BS, hogwash. Does he believe what he's saying? I think he does, because he's getting bad advice. Russia's economy is the best it's been in a long time. Now, he did mention on the side of Ukraine 1 million casualties. That's probably true. But and I'm trying to figure out, you know, the president's got this, his head tipped off to the right and his left high shoulder is high. I could fix that, Mr. President. I could fix that for you so easy. I'm just trying to figure out how to get a message to the White House. There's this boy out there in Utah that can get rid of that terrible pain in your neck. And you see the anterior weight bearing, his head's going way forward of his shoulders. He's got to be in pain. Oh, anyway, with this idea of the national security perspective, in that vein, I'm looking at Marco Rubio, who's taken over now as Secretary of State. While his remarks until now have somewhat been in a very, very positive way, there are some worrisome things about what he's saying. The new canal that the Ortega family in Nicaragua, in conjunction with the Chinese money and perhaps others, want to build through the Central American Isthmus, bypass the Panama, and go straight for this new canal through Nicaragua. It's probably necessary in the long term because there's all kinds of problems developing with the Panama Canal that indicate that for geological reasons and money cost and such, it might not be able to keep up with the kind of changes that are necessary for the Panama Canal to continue to be productive, which tells you something about Donald Trump's knowledge of the Panama Canal, if he wants to take it over nonetheless. Sorry, I will get that taken care of right now, once again, having forgotten my role. All right, sorry about that. So, things that are going on in our hemisphere, at least this projection of the Fortress America that they're talking about, and some comments offhand about Canada, about the Panama Canal, about Greenland, have got a lot of people worried, who really worry seriously about some of these things, concerned about the whole concept of Fortress America, which means withdrawing from NATO, of course. If it means looking at America's security and the security of others only if it's risk or in jeopardy. I'm all for that. But I think this global thing, this empire has been doing is quite unproductive so far, quite damaging to the global scene, and quite in opposition to the forces that are at work in the world right now. And what are those forces? I've given some negatives I've seen so far regarding Trump. I don't mean to downplay them, because some of the promises, some of these real situations are domestic, and the force that's moving in the world right now is a titanic shift of global power from the west to the east. And the magnet of that force, that might not be the best term to use, but it's kind of a sucking of power, is happening because of the reality of the global economy and the players in the global economy, the primary one of which is China. And you have to say that China is embedded in that region of the world where the future lies economically and perhaps otherwise. I don't mean to say that, well, the West doesn't have any influence or the West doesn't have any power anymore. I simply mean that the major amount of power in the world that counts is going to be in the East, not in the West. And that's a real blow to America. It's a real blow to the empire, which has husbanded that power to its chest since 1945, certainly, since the end of the Cold War anyway, and thought it was America has treated itself, the rest of the world, as a hegemon. And unfortunately, we've acted in all these wars, all these sanctions, setting in all manner of security these design mechanisms that have just failed catastrophically. And it's not slowing down or stopping this tectonic shift of economic, the black hole, center of gravity kind of thing, from the west to the east. You know that 1 in 5 people on the earth is Chinese? 1 in 5 people on the earth is Indian? 3 in 5 people are Asian or from Asia? That is inexorable evidence of the fact that the power is not just shifting, it's going to shift. And the population-wise is already dramatically shifted. And the empire wants to fight that. Tooth and nail, it's going to fight that. The empire, the existing financial Atlantic empire, City of London, Wall Street, is going to fight this as best they can. And how do you fight it when you can't do it economically at a diplomatic table? Pull out the guns. And that's why the West is backing what's going on in the Ukraine. That's why the West is backing what's going on in Gaza. And that's why and what's going on in Syria. We just dispatched a whole bunch more troops to Syria. I'm sure you heard of it. And I'm waiting to see if Donald Trump did that or if the Pentagon did it without his knowledge, because the Pentagon did things like that without his knowledge in his first term. So the empire has embarked on this attempt by creating chaos and confusion from the Arctic Circle to the southern ports of the Persian Gulf, heck, maybe even all the way down to Antarctica, in order to build a bridge or a fence or whatever term you want to use, to separate the further development of the East that's at odds with the development and the hegemonic power the West is slowly losing day by day. And oddly enough, Europe lies right along that wall that's being created. So does the Levant in the Middle East. Not oddly enough, you might call that, in the good old Mackinder terms, the geographical pivot point in history. And so, look at what we did with Ukraine. Look at the situation Ukraine's in now. You look at the railroad, the Ukraine was supposed to be one of the major thoroughfares, major stop-off points of the superhighway Chinese railway system from Beijing to Paris. And the rail network that China was working on, reduces the specific port shipping time down to a day and a half, 2 days on high-speed rail. 2 days from Beijing to Paris. They've got 45,000 miles in China already of this high-speed rail, 300 kilometers an hour. And the Ukraine was supposed to be the heart of that. And this was how you were going to get the majority of Chinese production into the heart of Europe. And that's been stopped by this war in Ukraine, which may be one of the reasons for the stopping of the war in Ukraine. Other things like that have stopped the wars that empires were engaged in before. You might even say that that was what was introduced to us with Davos, this Davos briefing, trying to be restrained and kept in place by the United States with some of the comments that Trump was making. Because they don't want that shift to take place to what the Chinese are calling the ASEAN community-like situation, the ASEAN community-like idea, ASEA, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. It's a group of nations that have more or less told the empire to go to hell for years now with regard to security, and they don't want to do security. They want to do alliances designed for security. And what we wanted to do, of course, because they represent a fairly formidable group of nations in Asia that are very profitable economically and financially, we want them to take on a security nature like NATO, like our relationship with Japan, like our relationship with South Korea, like our relationship with Australia, and to a certain extent New Zealand, the AUKUS group. It was interesting in Rubio's confirmation hearings. The question was asked to him what he thought about the ASEAN relationship. He didn't know what they were talking about. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, he didn't know what they were talking about. And this is a group of nations, like I said, that have told the West, have told Wall Street, have told the City of London to go to hell, they're going to go do their own business. And it was, not an offshoot of the BRICS, it was kind of paralleling BRICS, that they're tired of the hegemonic plantation control of Western banking system over their countries. And so they're not going to go along with the West any longer, because their whole purpose is collaboration and cooperation with one another. How can we do business with one another that will benefit one another rather than steal from one another, as Western economic policies have existed for quite some time now? And that's what they think the future is. And they see the United States as the empire it represents at odds with what their intent is. And I don't know whether Donald Trump understands this. Not that I'm any smarter, it's just like what I was saying earlier, I think he's getting some really bad advice. Militarily, economically, domestically. Although he seems to be cutting through the fog somewhat, trying to fulfill his campaign promises. And he has nothing to lose except his life, because he can't be reelected. I'm not sure he understands this. I don't know that he does. He may intuit a little bit. He may intuitively realize what's happening, and that might explain some of the kind of crazy things he said and that he pretends to do, and maybe will do some things that actually might in the end right the ship of state so to speak, more in line with this kind of future, rather than the future of the empire holding on to us with blood and guts and bayonets and bombs. And my greatest fear, when it sees that for the empire, virtually over, the last step, of course, in the dying throes of an empire today would be nuclear steps. You remember in 1945, the only time any country ever used these heinous, horrible weapons to kill other human beings was America. And I think there's a real chance that when it comes down to it, if our leadership does not change its mind about maintaining whatever cost is necessary to maintain American hegemony in the world, we may end up using nuclear weapons as a last resort to try and maintain that nonetheless. At least that's my biggest fear right now regarding our immediate future. I don't know if I'll live to see it. I'm 74. But if we are as dramatically inept in world affairs for the next 20 years as we have been the last 20 years, I mean, we could get to that point a lot faster than 20 years. And with China and Russia, and even to the Middle East with Iran, we could get to that point within whatever time I've got left on this globe. And it's very disturbing to think about that with regard to my children and my grandchildren, and for all the children that are not mine. So, I would say that the empire is being defeated right now on every front, and that's why they're scrambling as they are. I figure these sanctions that we've established out there affect negatively anywhere from 2 to 2.5 billion people on this planet from this little country that represents, I think, less than 4% of the world population. We have this sanction machine that just never seems to stop. And much of the world now, I would guess from polling data, probably a third of the world, maybe even a higher number, is being affected by these sanctions and probably despises us. They despise not just the empire, they despise America because of these sanctions. That even affects medical supplies to their children. And then you throw Gaza into this, and the genocide that's happening in Gaza, and the clear knowledge to most of the world that this genocide could not possibly be happening without us 100% 24/7 backing it up, us, the US, the United States. And a lot of people would just as soon see this go away because it creates an awful lot of hatred for America around this planet. So that's another problem that President Trump's got to deal with. From state-supported torture, which President George W. Bush actually did for the first time in American history, state-supported torture of enemies. I mean, America's tortured before. We had torture in Vietnam. And it had tortured in the Philippines at the turn of the 20th century. And it had tortured before, but it never, as a matter of presidential edict, a presidential policy, declared human torture as a part of our policies. And it did that under President George W. Bush. But our reputation took horrible blows all across the planet. And now Gaza. And President Trump just said, yeah, give them the 2,000-pound bombs. Has set another round of horrible blows to the reputation of our country. And regardless of what we may think of the state of the empire today, its reputation was still because of the republic existing beneath the empire. that underneath all that pestilence and poison and mess is a great hope for the planet. And the great hope for the planet is to not send 2,000-pound bombs to Gaza. It's not to continue the flow of weapons. It looks like there may have been, even though there's debate back and forth as to whether or not Trump has cut off weapons to the Ukraine. There's evidence that they're still flowing. America could turn from this sanctimonious, hegemonic master who knows what's best for everybody else on this planet, monster that it has become, to the great light on the side of the hill that Reagan talked about. That fast. So we still have huge power in this world, but not for the right reason. And that's another part of the disintegration of an empire. Because you look at the history of empires, they all eventually end. So we're at a point of inflection in history. Kind of, I think it was Jeffrey Sachs that called it a global crossroads. Because the empire is about to go away. But the problem is, it could last a long time in the going away. As there's this Indian saying, the dying elephant can thrash a lot of grass. I just hope that none of that grass is nuclear. So, is it difficult, you know, when you, a couple of issues about recruitment in the armed forces. Because that's something that's a serious problem in other countries as well as our own. We just can't recruit quality people into the military. Now you could blame it on DEI and you could blame it on Biden. You could blame it on the Defense Department. But there's something else, because some of the quotes that I've seen from some of the interviews of young men, not women, young men of recruitment age, saying things like, I don't want to serve a country that sends people out to die for nothing but BlackRock. That's the kind of question you've got going on out there right now. And then the second part, it's interesting why women have stepped up the way in which they have in the military. And I think the data is going to show the recruiters will be responsible for compiling this data, but I think it's going to show that it was a combination of things. Because where did the recruiting arm of our four major, well, there's 5 or 6 there, Coast Guard and Merchant Marine and other things, where did they go to recruit? Did they go here to Salt Lake City? They went into the states that they normally go to, states like West Virginia, the interior of Maine, the interior of Oklahoma, Alabama, Mississippi, states where people don't have a whole lot of opportunity. And women were graduating from high school faster, and that's still a requirement. You have to have a high school graduation or a GED equivalent. And more often, well, it's one of those things they haven't thrown away. Because a high school graduation is the greatest determinant of what your soldier is going to be like later, or your Marine, or airman, or whatever else. So there were more high school graduates, and that's happening across the country because women are graduating from high school and university more than men are right now. And then the next factor, the bonus for signing up. Do you know what it is? Or at least it was here recently. Because you can go into the services, train for a specialty, so that when you get out you have a job, but you get a $50,000 bonus in your hands. You know, I've hired a number of people in my business over the years. I never gave one of them a $50,000 bonus. Or in the case of specialty stuff in some of these services with greater education, you might get more than $50,000. That's probably the most money in cash in their hand of anybody from the West Virginia mountains. Now, I lived in the West Virginia mountains for a while, in the 7th grade. And I have a brother that was born in the West Virginia mountains. 2 brothers, actually, both my brothers born in the West Virginia mountains, have been there a lot in my youth. And I know how, I want to be careful what I say here, as I don't want to offend anybody. But there are areas of this country that are very impoverished. The interior of West Virginia, the interior of Alabama, the interior of Oklahoma, especially around the reservations, the interior of Mississippi, the interior of Arkansas. You go in there with these kinds of offers, and you have to have a high school graduation to take advantage of it, and more women graduate from high school than men, you've got a bunch of women going into the services. Now, when you see some of these DEI people being fired or laid off or furloughed or whatever else by President Trump, that's not who I'm talking about. I'm talking about the fact that there's more women going in there than men. And that's why people like Colonel Wilkerson's talking about conscription. I still have mixed feelings about that. But women have really felt empowered, particularly since they were introduced to all of these what they call MOSs, military occupational specialists, including combat. Now that's going to be reversed. Now that's going to be completely reversed by Secretary Hegseth and Donald Trump. They already said they're going to do it. And as a matter of fact, there are generals, general officers, and admirals who are females who have expressed in one way or another being worried sick about that they're going to be released. As you know, he's already released the head of the Coast Guard, a female. And the discussion is that there are several large commands with 3 and 4 stars who are women who are going to have new commanders very shortly, and that's going to probably be a disincentive for women to come in, and then you're going to have to go back to having the same problem you had before. So it's not just, you can't just go in there and say, we're going to remake the Army, make it a man's army again. There's all these logistical problems that need to be taken care of, created by policies that, for whatever reason, were instituted several years ago. And so England, interestingly enough, Britain is having the same problem. Back when Powell, and you go back to the times of the first Iraq War, the British Army, I was looking at some stuff about this the other day, is totally different than it is today. And the difference is the tremendous amount of women that are in there. Now, I'm not saying one way or another, but the Royal Marines, I mean, I'm in my 70s, so I have a particular understanding of what military is comprised of, never having been in the military. I'm certainly not a military professional. My military experience is purely armchair. But what I've heard, and I believe it, is that the entire English army would fit inside an NFL stadium here in America. And that's it. So we're going to find out how serious Hegseth is about women not being able to do anything serious in the military anymore. But that's certainly going to be a disincentive for women to come into the military, which has been the number one source of recruits. I don't want to repeat myself. I'm just trying to hit this point home. How are you going to get a man's army again? What kind of incentives? Now, a couple of things about Trump getting out of NATO. Because back in 2017, when he went over and inaugurated the new NATO headquarters, and all the European leaders were, queued up there, and he basically told them off. He gave them a good dressing down like a bunch of private school children for not spending enough money on defense. Now he's calling for 5% of these nations' GDP, which of course is never going to happen. But this may be just Trump playing the deal. Maybe he'd settle for 4% or 3.5%, the art of the deal thing. But is he serious, or is he just trying to bully more money out of the Europeans for their own defense? I don't know if he knows himself if he'll go any further in his press for this to take place in the UN. This is a decision he has to make with several of the people that he's positioned around him. As I said in the first hour, I think he's getting an awful lot of bad advice. But when you go, he seems to be serious about Fortress America. And one of the elements of that might be this dramatic withdrawal from Europe and breaking the transatlantic link for something other than economic purposes. I mean, this could be Trump's ultimate goal. And this is why so many world leaders consider him so dangerous, because they can't figure him out. Because as they try to chart him, he's over here, but then all of a sudden he's over here, and then he's over here, and then he's up here, and then he's down here. Is he an isolationist? Is that what he's trying to do? There are a lot of isolationist sentiments in America right now. I don't know that I particularly consider that the best thing, because it's too much like the analogies we used with Hitler and Chamberlain and all the things that happened in the 1930s leading to World War II because of certain isolationist policies that were going on inside our country. And every incident in history seems to have its own discrete character. So to pull these things and say, well, it's the isolationist ideas of America that led us to our involvement in World War II, I don't think it's too accurate, because I don't think we were isolated that much in the 30s. I think we were just stupid. We had stupid economic policies. Roosevelt, coming in 33, started to turn some of those things around from the policies of Hoover and Coolidge that led to the crash, just turning, economic decisions over to the marketplace. You can't do that, because there's too many people powerful in the marketplace that control the market, as you can see right now with the oligarchs. And on a global scene, that's why you have tariffs. That's why the founders made sure we had tariffs listed in our Constitution. So you can be involved in global dynamics and global maneuvers from a position of intelligence or from a position of stupidity, which is where we've been. And as I was saying earlier, 2 out of 5 people are Chinese. 3 out of 5 people on this planet are Asian. And that's the magnet. That's the vacuum, the entrance to the vacuum that is pulling the entire business dynamic of this planet in that direction. And what is our answer? sanction them. If we would spend a lot more attention and devotion and resources towards what's really important in rebuilding relationships between countries, instead of wasting it in foreign wars and under the misnomer of defending our allies, we would be so much better off. Couple of things about Zelensky and the Ukraine. I'm kind of running out of time. A lot of this I have to go over till tomorrow. And tomorrow, the first hour will be radio broadcast. The second hour will be streaming. So, a couple of more things that I want to get into. I think the question, one of the main dynamics behind what's happening in the Ukraine is the British role in the provocation of Russia, the poking the tummy of the bear's tummy. And when you look at the history of the British role involved in the Iraq weapons of mass destruction story, and the British in general in the NATO expansion, it seems that when you talk about an empire, you're basically talking about what became after World War II, initially an Anglo-American empire. And so, in the interview that went on between Wilkerson and Helga LaRouche, he kind of identified himself coming out of the Eisenhower tradition. And it seems that the Eisenhower tradition is the World War II tradition of non-empire, going back to the idea that the United States was an anti-colonial republic. That was the dynamic in the formation of our country in the first place, was to be anti-colonial. And that was Kennedy's view. And that was Roosevelt's view at Yalta, Malta and Yalta, when he turned to Churchill and said, "Your colonial days are over. We're not going to back colonialism on this planet anymore." I don't know if that accelerated Roosevelt's death or what, but Roosevelt, and then after him was Eisenhower, who was anti-colonial because he saw in the European War what colonialism had done. And then Kennedy after him. And then Kennedy spoke from the Senate floor a couple of times before his election as president against the French role in Vietnam and Algeria. But it was after the Kennedy assassination that the United States became more of the old classic imperial force. And so there are people who take exception to Eisenhower being a role model of any sort. We'll always throw out the 1953 coup against Mossadegh and the 54 coup against, what's his name in Guatemala, strictly for the Dulles brothers and the law firm that they served and getting control of the Guatemalan banana business. And some other nefarious things that Eisenhower supposedly did. And while there's reason to censor Eisenhower for some of these activities, there's also reason to say that he was a very, very smart man. He knew he was up against a humongous bureaucracy growing every month in his own country. And he would call it upon his exit, as you well know, the military-industrial complex. And it didn't start in January of 1960. It started immediately following the end of World War II, when a bunch of war profiteers and other people, the so-called FDR dollar men, decided, whoa, This war is a very profitable experience. Fighting on two fronts against Hitler and Japan, and our allies all out there prostrate in the dust waiting for us to help them. They're all out there broken. Boy, we could sell all these weapons to them as well. Not only our government, we could sell it to them. And so we better keep this Cold War going. We got to keep this fear out there as long as we can, so we can get these great profits that we've been enjoying up to this point to continue. And so Eisenhower tried to fight that. His entire 8 years in office, he had to fight that. He knew before the war was over there in May of 1945 what he was up against as a general of the Allied armies. He wanted to fight it because he knew it was disruptive and ultimately it would be injurious to the freedoms of the American citizens. There was this press conference in particular I learned about where he got very irritated because he didn't like press conferences. Most generals don't. Because generals are being asked by questions by people who usually are not military people and have no understanding of how the military really works except the headlines. And he said, I don't want to spend one penny more on defense than we have to. And you didn't see Eisenhower, I mean, he was red in the face in this interview. He meant it, he absolutely meant it. But that's gone, that's completely gone. And the reason it's gone is because of what he said on his way out the door. The military-industrial complex. And he gave a far more eloquent talk to the Association of Newspaper Editors. In his first year as president, it's often called the Cross of Iron speech. And no doubt his speechwriters took the image of William Jennings Bryan and his Cross of Gold speech. And what Eisenhower said in that speech in very eloquent terms was how much the war economy took away from the Americans. It took away hospitals. It took away modern homes. It took away better highways. It took all the things that the United States of America, as originally conceived, was supposed to have been doing in the most interested way, and substituted death and destruction and war, and a complex that ultimately would interfere with our own liberties and freedom, which it most definitely has. So I see Eisenhower as sort of a transition point in going from the republic that entered World War II to the empire that came out of World War II and has control and losing control rapidly now with this planet. And the only thing keeping it in check was the rival Soviet Union. So, and now they're out of the way. Now you've got Vanguard, State Group, and BlackRock that you have to deal with. I think we're coming up here to the end of the program. Yes, we are. I think I'll try and pick this up tomorrow at this point. Because it's time to go. All good things come to an end, and so is this. I will see you all tomorrow.